Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation. So, Audie, for all you Audie fans, is not in the front window. He is in the kitchen, sleeping on the table, because there's a window right next to the table, and it has a lovely western exposure. So he is basking in the afternoon sun. If I had to guess, I would say God himself could not part the cat from that window, so I don't think we're likely to see him today. But, be that as it may, if he shows up, he shows up. And, to tell you the truth, it's very hard for that cat to resist a camera. Yellow, and the yellow is right here in our little pin. We'll talk about that in a second. The yellow is for Catherine, it's for Lex's mom, it is for everyone whose life has been impacted by cancer. We are wishing all of you the very, very best. So pin. I have this pin, well, I should probably mention, this is a cashmere sweater. And on these videos, I will tell you what I'm wearing and what I paid for it. 100% cashmere, Macy's, $40. By the way, I think they still have these available. Just saying. The pin, I am using the little, here, let me take that off so I can show you. Remember the little pin backs? It's a magnetic disc that you just slip onto the back of your brooch. There's another little magnetic disc. And let me see if I can do this. Oh, I'm thinking I can do it, obviously. It's just a question of how long is it going to take and how ridiculous am I going to look while I'm trying to get this together. There we go. Not very long. And those were sent to me by Colleen, the pin and the little magnetic catch discs. So I am glad to have an opportunity to let you see how they work. You can see the magnetic disc behind this particular pin. But I think on larger brooches, you probably won't be able to. But we are going to find out in the upcoming weeks, because I have made up my mind that I am going to start showing you more of the jewelry that has been sent to me or crafted for me by our viewers. So let's start with this. This is from Randy. And by the way, I'm not going to give you last names because I don't have their permission. This is from Randy. And this is a lovely piece. It's all one long chain, so I can wear it any way I want to. And she crocheted this. And it's all this delicate little crochet work with pearls and little gem beads. And I get so many compliments on this. And every time I go through the jewelry that viewers have given me, I always say, I'm going to have to start wearing some of this more often. And finally, I think the message has sunken in, and I am going to start wearing this so that you can see. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. And much of it, like this, is just handmade pieces. Somebody with a crochet hook, a spool of thread, and some beads went to town. So thank you, Randy. Thank you, Colleen. And we're just going to start showing them off. Okay. We're going to be back right after the intro, 22 seconds, as you know, and then we're going to get started. So, what's going on here at my house? Well, I've been feeling nostalgic lately, and a lot of that is coming from putting together videos for these weekend broadcasts, the Coffee and Conversation, thinking back to times when things were different, looking at things like changes in fashion and skincare and all kinds of arenas like that. And I think as a result, it has made me a little nostalgic. The interesting thing is I am not nostalgic for the time frame I would have expected. I describe myself as a child of the 60s, but that is in the sense that I was raised in that period of chaos. That's when I grew up. The transition from the staid and very status quo 1950s to the anything goes 1960s. And yes, I am in fact a product of that time. No two ways around it. But is that a time that I get nostalgic for? No. I remember the 60s. I remember thinking the world was going to end at any moment, that we were like on the brink, that the famous nuclear clock was positioned at 30 seconds before midnight. The Vietnam War, all of us who were around in the 60s lost people to that war. For me, the closest was The Boy Next Door. That is kind of tragic. We were never friends particularly, but we kind of grew up together. He was a couple of years older than I was, and he went and never came back. By the way, I did, in fact, many, many years later, go to the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C., and I did find his name there. And it was a lot more emotionally unsettling for me than I expected. And I have to say, a lot of people go there, they find it a cathartic experience. I found it a horrifically depressing experience, because all I could think of was the boy that I knew as a youngster, the young adult I knew. He was in his 20s when he was drafted. That was all he got. And yeah, very, very depressing. So am I nostalgic for that time, for a time of student riots and, drugs and the threat of Cold War and losing people I went to high school with somewhere halfway across the world? No, I am not nostalgic for that. I do not want the 60s back. And if somebody offered me the opportunity to go back there, despite the fact that there are very, very many periods in my life I would happily revisit. Oh, not that one. Thank you very much. Boy, am I glad that chaos is over with. What I get nostalgic for is the 1980s. And that's been happening to me more and more lately, because I tend to watch, and I don't want to say religiously or regularly, but I watch the YouTube videos of younger influencers and fashionistas. Now, part of that is because I don't want to become one of those stereotypical old grandmothers who is so lost in my own time that I just can't make room for changes, new ways of doing things, new fashions, new hairstyles, whatever. I got to get a new hairstyle. This is all over the place. But I tend to tune into them occasionally, and a lot of them do these retrospective looks. They will say, well, this, that, and the other thing was going on in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and I just want to kind of grab them and say, oh no, darling, you are so far off the mark. I don't fault them for this. They weren't alive then. They don't know. All they know about these time frames is what the mass media is telling them. They don't know what it was like to be there. But I have been seeing some of these, I'll look back videos to the 1980s, and boy, was that a great time to be alive. And I know, not great for everybody, and just as I am quite certain that many of you had a fabulous time in the 60s, I did not. So that's 60s, no. 80s, yes. When the decade began, I was 25. So I was just old enough to be able to go out and like buy my own clothing without my mother's input, but not quite old enough to know really what my style was. I'm not even sure I know now. But it was a good time to be alive for me, given where I was and what I was doing. I was in New England, which is a good place to be. There's just no two ways around it. If I were going to be anywhere, where would I choose to be? New England, because frankly, we had it all. And I know other people will say, no, I was in London in the 80s and I loved the daylights out of it. Yes, we all have our own little preferences. So this is just what's sparking for me. And it may not be what's sparking for you. However, I really want to hear what your nostalgia tug is. What is it that, you look at a video, you dig out an old movie, whatever. What is it that makes you say, oh yeah, those were the good old days? Let me know in the video comments. What I'm finding is that most people who start talking about the 80s talk about the over-the-top stuff. For example, the big hair, which, by the way, was there for both men and women, and the even bigger shoulders for both men and women. And that's what people looking back on the decade tend to focus on. What I like about the 80s, just in terms of fashion, we're going to stick with that for a while, is that was not the whole story. Yes, we did indeed have big hair, big shoulders. Okay, I'll give you that one. But we also had a resurgence of Victorian fashion. People tend not to remember that, but that was a huge thing, particularly in the early 80s. And we would see these wonderful, fluffy Victorian blouses with the lace and the frills and the ruffles, and Laura Ashley fashions. That was huge then. Gunny Sacks, these companies that were coming up with nostalgic fashions. You often hear that described as prairie style, although it most certainly was not. They were recreating styles that were very sophisticated and would have absolutely been city fashions and, in fact, formal or at least semi-formal city fashions. No, the pioneer lassies did not dress like this. But you know who did? Princess Diana. Those of you who are old enough to remember Diana from the early days, from when she and Charles were announcing their engagement to when they first got married, etc., you will remember that Diana was a great lover of those Victorian styles. And I think, in fact, she was largely responsible for making them quite as widespread as they were. So we had room for the sleek, structured, big shoulder pads. We also had room for the dresses that I would today call cottagecore. Yeah, we had a little bit of everything out there. Now, I personally was never a fan of the giant padded shoulders. I got shoulders enough on my own. In fact, I was just thinking, when I was a teenager and I would stand in front of a full-length mirror, I used to think my head was very small. I really did. But I have a small head. How do you fix that? The truth of the matter is, my head measurement is 22 inches, which puts me 1/4 of an inch above average. It's these monsters that make my head look small by comparison. So yes, I love the 80s. I would go out, get clothing, rip out the shoulder pads, wear it. Oh, by the way, it fit just fine without the shoulder pads because I got my own padding. And I loved it. Yeah, that was just great. Big shoulders, that was my decade. But when we look back, there was so much more. And like I say, everything from that massive shoulders right through to the super feminine styles. You could wear a very, very short mini skirt. You could wear a knee-length skirt. A lot of people did. You could wear a skirt that just sort of fell below the knees or dragged along the floor, and it was all okay. I really like the fact that so much was available and open in the 80s that we were not pigeonholed into a certain sort of look. In fact, let me pull that up again. One of the pictures I showed you of a Victorian blouse was paired with blue jeans. So we have this like ultra feminine, lacy, frilly, silky thing on top of what anyone would have to call ultra casual, rugged clothing, jeans. So there was a lot to choose from. Also, in the 80s, that was when this whole fitness movement that we see today, that was when that began. That was when it just sort of started and took off. Well, I can't really say started, because going back to the 1950s with Jack LaLanne, there was a fitness movement, but it was never as widespread. It did not hit pop culture the way things like, Jane Fonda, because everybody from Jane Fonda right through to Angela Lansbury was putting out these workout videos. And I think that was a good thing to come out of the decade. We all began to become a little more conscious of the need to get out, move around, get some exercise. I can remember, now we're going back to the 60s, when exercising was just not done. It was not only not cool, but it was considered unladylike. The idea of a grown woman putting on shorts and running down the street was, well, it was a little suspicious. You would look at somebody like that and say, oh, that's weird. Why is she doing this? Because it just wasn't done. It wasn't considered ladylike. It wasn't considered elegant. It wasn't considered grown up. It was the sort of thing that we expected from children. But we as adults, as young adults, the only reason you worked out is if you were an athlete. And that represents a tiny little segment of the population. The average person was not walking, running, bicycling for their health. It just wasn't a thing. It became a thing in the 80s. And great. This is, in fact, wonderful that this became a thing, because I think in general, we are all that much healthier for it. And when I think back to the 60s and I think of my concern about a nuclear holocaust, and I have that. Everybody did to some extent or another. We started off back in the 1950s, hiding under our desks from the mythical Russian nuclear attack. We did, I did it, hide under my desk. Yeah, we grew up with this sort of doomsday threat hanging over us. 1980s, and we've got perestroika and glasnost and tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev. Yeah, we were in what felt like a safer time. I'm not going to say it was, because I think every time has its dangers, but we felt safer as a whole. So, yeah, that's a time I'm nostalgic for. And I have given that a lot of thought lately. What was it about that time that just resonates with me so much? I think part of it is how old I was going into that decade. that period, 25. You're just old enough to be an adult, but you're not old enough to be old. And that may be a part of it. The fact that my fashion style was kind of developed in that period, that may also be a part of it. There is a piece of me that actually likes those Laura Ashley dresses and those 1980s frilly Victorian blouses. And I think it might be some manifestation of mental illness, because truly that's not me. But I have to admit, there's a part of me that says, yeah, those things are very, very pretty. And there's a part of me that just says, gee, I wish I could be that girly girl wandering around in those frilly clothes. I can't. It's not who I am. So I can't. It's just, no. The larger part of me is just looking at that little tiny bit of myself and just saying, get thee behind me, Satan. But I do like the fact that it was all there. It was all open to us. You could go to work in slacks. That was new. In the 70s, in general, and I have to be careful when I say this, because a lot of women worked in factories and basically would have been hard-pressed to wear anything but trousers in their work environment. But in an office environment, if you worked in a retail store, for example, now even in the 70s, trousers were pretty much taboo. By the 1980s, it was acceptable. You could wear your pants anywhere you wanted to go. That was great. Absolutely terrific. You could express yourself however you wanted to. And in the 80s, with that big hair, not everybody looked like Dolly Parton. Gosh, not even Dolly Parton looked like, well, yes, she did. All right, I'm sorry. Dolly Parton's always had big hair. But we didn't have to look like Dolly Parton with massive hair. You could wear other hairstyles and not be considered someone, yes, who was out of sync with the times. And there were many other people who chose a different look. Those looks were equally acceptable. And that was interesting, because in times past, yes, in case you haven't noticed, we did get company. There were times when we simply couldn't do that, when you were required to wear, in effect, a uniform. In the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, women had a certain range of hairstyles that were acceptable. We got into the early 60s, and it was the Beehive's early dolly. And then in the later 60s, it was just everything was long and straight. But by the 80s, we were a little more open to differences, and I think that's great. So that is the time I am, yes, I know, I hear you purr. That is the time I am getting nostalgic for. I'm not quite here. Turn around and say, there we go. We don't generally get a good face shot of Audie. So, yes, enjoy. I don't think he's coming back. I think he feels I betrayed him. So that's what is sparking my little nostalgia thing here. And I'm looking at this now and I'm thinking to myself, is this just a fashion thing? It was something that came out of listening to the young fashionistas talking about that period in time. And as I say, my own reaction as someone who had lived through it, thinking, no, they're wrong. They are trying to encapsulate a huge and varied palette, which is what we had available to us, in a couple of more outlandish manifestations. You know, like I said, the big hair, the big shoulders, that's what everybody gloms onto. But they forget about the very ultra-feminine styles coming out of that period. They forget about the casual styles that came out of that period as a result of this whole fitness trend. When we started saying, yeah, it's okay to wear a sweatshirt. Yeah, it's okay to wear sneakers or trainers for my British friends. You can do this. It's all right. And by breaking down the existing standards, I know there are a few of you, I'm sure, who are saying, ooh, I don't like that part. But by so doing, everything was thrown out there. If everything is acceptable, you get to pick and choose. And being able to pick and choose is just so wonderful. And then even later, I saw an end to that. Later, I saw society in general drawing lines between athleisure, like, oh, this is casual clothing, and then dress clothing, which was very different, and there was a very firm line. But as we saw with the Victorian blouse, by the way, that was a 1980s photo, I should say that, with the Victorian blouse and the faded blue jeans, wasn't so in the 80s. Mostly because these were emerging trends and nobody quite knew what to do with them, where they all fit into the overall scheme of things. And it's very natural with emerging trends to see people do a lot of experimenting. And this is, of course, predating the period in which these things became separated, when jeans became casual and silk blouses became dressy, and we don't pair them off anymore. You just don't see that. And is that not unusual given the fact that we already had that as a precedent from the 80s? And by the way, I think that Victorian blouse worn with blue jeans looks terrific. It's not something I'm going to get into because, like I say, the part of me that says, oh, that's so pretty, it's a very small part of me, and that Victorian blouse is not me. I wish it were, but it's not. So no, you can give up any hope of ever seeing me show up on a video looking like that. But it's interesting that it was okay for us then. It's not so okay now. If you did that now, people would think that you were not properly put together, that there was too great a disconnect between the top half of your outfit and the bottom half of your outfit. In the 80s, we were fine with that. So that's one of the things I do miss, that all-encompassing, all-embracing acceptance of do your own thing, man, which, by the way, came out of the 60s, but I think we embraced it in a way the 60s never did, because in the 60s, if you did not have long straight hair and blue jeans, you were not part of the counterculture group. You were part of the over 30 group. We all had our own uniforms, and my goodness, were we wedded to them. Because, yes, young people in the 60s had a certain look, and we didn't like it when our parents dressed like we did, and we sure weren't dressing the way our parents were dressing. So, no, we were not all accepting. We were not all embracing. We liked the people who were like us, and we thought the people who did not look like us were fascist pigs. Remember that? Yes, everybody and everything that disagreed with us was a fascist pig. Meanwhile, our parents' generation was looking at us saying, commie trash. So it cut both ways. But yes, 80s, that's where I want to go back to. Well, not really, but if I could, no, I'll change that. Not if I could. If I could, maybe I would. But if I had to choose a time from the past, that's probably the time I would choose. And that's the time I'm getting nostalgic for. All right, so this is enough of my rant and ramble. It's just 80s nostalgia. And Audie is coming back. Do you want to say goodbye? Well, come on up. Well, get yourself up. I'm not picking you up. Come on, you're a healthy cat. Move your own butt up here. All right. Yes, he may be healthy, but he's very spoiled. And because I picked him up, he doesn't want to be here. Now he'll come back, he'll jump up on his own, because it only works when he's the decider. All right, that is what I have for you today. And we may, depending on your comments, we'll see where your comments take this. We may develop this a little more tomorrow, because I do think there are some decades that just plain resonate with our generation more than others. And for me, it's the 80s. Tell me what it is for you. So we're going to take a look at a slideshow on the way out. And I hope to see you back tomorrow. Meanwhile, have a terrific day.